Ladies and gentlemen, episode number 362 of We Are Podcast. I am Ronsley. This is a great podcast compilation by my team from some of the previous episodes that I have done. It is called Behind the Microphone, the Art of Podcast Creation. And we have some legends in the house. There's Joey Coleman, and he talks about the need for clear podcast boundaries. Jason Irving and I discuss social media to streamline guest invitations. Cameron Herold and I talk about outlining methods for boosting podcast visibility. Athin Cassiotis and I talk about curiosity-driven interview questions. Byron Dempsey, I love talking about Byron because I knew him before he was a podcaster. He came to We Are Podcast, started a podcast, and now he's a legendary podcaster. We talk about the value of in-person interviews. And finally, Jeff Maines advocated for video content and early platform adoption. We cover all of that and more on this episode of We Are Podcast. Come, let's learn.
You can't find your voice if you don't use it. This is We Are Podcast, formerly called Should I Start a Podcast? A podcast for podcasters who want a podcast that grows their business and brand. How many times can we say podcast in a sentence? Here's your host, Ronsley. He has interviewed more than 1,500 people, has been listened to over 5 million times in 133 countries. He has helped create over 1,100 podcasts for businesses, brands, and personalities. He's been doing this for more than a decade. Get ready to take notes. Enjoy the show.
What happens when you hit the record button? What is that process like for Joey?
Yeah, this is a gigantic question, but let me try to narrow it down as much as I can. And any of these things that you want to pull on the thread, don't hesitate to.
Sure.
So first and foremost, my co-host, Dan Gingiss, and I made some very conscious decisions early on about what our podcast is, and more importantly, actually, what our podcast isn't. And we created some clear, bright lines that still allow us to experiment and try new things, but it made getting distracted less common. It made going off course less of a threat. Because as long as we keep coming back to what we're trying to do and coming back on a regular basis, it allows us to keep moving forward. So a couple of those boundaries that we decided on. We wanted a show that was about a half an hour long. Sometimes it goes up as much as 45 minutes, but for the most part, it's a shorter show. We wanted a show that had 3 10 to 12 minute segments. Now, sometimes those segments are 6 minutes, sometimes they're 17, but 3 segments that were bite-sized moments of customer and employee experience delight. When we came to thinking about sponsors and partners, we didn't want to do traditional ad reads. You don't like those. I don't like those. No listener in the history of the world likes those. We wanted to have partners, and not just in the sense that everybody who has a podcast wants partners. No, we wanted somebody that would actually say to us, we trust you to take our content and to turn it into something different, to turn it into something that is in alignment with our goals and our values, but is not a script that we handed you. It's a different approach. It's a different choice. It's a different consideration. And last but not least, we decided that we were not going to do interviews. Now, let me tell you, friends, you knock interviews out of there, your production and your scheduling has just gone from level 10 difficulty to level 1 difficulty instantly from that sole decision. Now, because Dan and I are co-hosts and we're both on every episode, we were already scheduling with each other to find time to record. We didn't want to augment that or complicate that by scheduling with a guest. So we've never had a guest in 10 seasons of episodes. We do about 16 episodes a season. We do a fall season and a spring season, kind of with a school year, and we take the summer off. And if somebody has something they want to say on our show that we think is valuable, we have them submit a less than 2-minute audio clip, and we insert it in the show. And that's our other voices. That's our vocal variety. We're not interviewing them live. We go to the tape, let folks hear what they have to say, and we come back. And we really only do that with authors or people that are truly remarkable, that we're telling a segment or a story about them, and we want to include that piece of the puzzle. So to answer your question, first and foremost, we narrow down what we're doing.
Yeah.
Now, what else do? We have a blend of scripting the shows where we actually write out a lot of what we're going to say. And then we have times where we just do bullet points of what we want to talk about. Really depends on the complexity of the topic.
Let's talk about what you do before you hit record.
I'll have a look at people on Facebook, look at people who are big players in their given industry, and I'll just put a shout out, send them a message, or usually I'll be a friend of theirs on Facebook. They'll have reached out to me and said, "Hey, how you going?" And I'll look at their profile and I'll see that they've got some magic, and I just ask them, do they want to be on my podcast? So I've only had one no, and I basically, just schedule a time to catch up, and then I get them to fill out a form. So they fill out a form of who they are, what they do, and a little bit of a bio. And then we use our date to catch up, press the play button, and it's pretty organic. So quite often I'll have some questions that I'll ask, but quite often the conversation goes where the person who is showing up wants to go. So depending on where they're at, it's pretty organic. So we have pretty much just a conversation about life and what's going on, and then finish the podcast, get it all edited, and put it up.
Just want to talk about the call to action that you have on it, or call to engagement. So what do you do to get someone to the next step? Like, if they've listened to your podcast a few times, do you have the call to actions on your podcast? What does that look like, and how do you structure them?
We do. We have pre-roll and mid-roll ads that are my ads. One is about the COO Alliance. One is about the Invest in Your Leaders course. We're also emailing every episode to our entire 50,000 person email list. So every week they're getting the new podcast episode. Once a month, we're sending a text message out to our entire text message list with whatever the best episode of the past month has been. We're also amplifying and sharing all the episodes on social media and trying to push it out on social media so that people go to the YouTube channel as well. So it's a combination of a few things. We just also know that by having it in our PSs, by making sure that we mention it lots, by making sure that we're sharing it with our email list, we kind of odd shucks our way into it by just making sure there's good exposure. And then I'm also running some remarketing ads with Google Remarketing and AdRoll for not very much money, like $200 a month. Anybody who's ever been to my website is seeing ads served in front of them about the Second in Command podcast. And I only pay if they click on the ad. Yeah. Most people never click on the ad, but they're getting all that branding and they're seeing the Second in Command podcast ads follow them around the internet. That's been very helpful for us as well.
Hey, it's Mick Hawes, host of The Toolshed. I love making my podcast, and that's primarily because Ronsley has helped me avoid a whole bunch of really basic mistakes that would have cost me a whole bunch of time, money, and energy. And Rons has compiled a list of these mistakes and how to avoid them, which is really a steal. You can get your copy where I downloaded mine at mistakes.wearepodcast.com. That is mistakes.wearepodcast.com. We Are Podcast. You can't find your voice if you don't use it.
If you can also tell us, what are your process to prep before you hit record?
Yeah, so I just have a simple Logitech, 1080p HD camera that I use. I'm still using it today. It still looks, still decent quality. I don't think you need anything massive, right? To do stuff with your computer there. Then I'm obviously using the Blue Yeti, which Ronsley loves. So I've been using that since mostly, from the start as well. I think lighting's very cool. So I definitely recommend having like 2 lights, which I normally have on either side. Now, it could be ring lights. I actually have box lights, which are more professional, to almost like photo shoot type lights. So I think lighting's really important there. Like, I think sound's the most important normally. Obviously, you want to have a decent video, but the lighting to be there. The tech side of things, really nice and simple, nothing too flash. Now, with how I prepare, and I think this is important, everybody does it a little bit differently. Now, I asked for a bio more recently as well. So if you can ask from a bio from someone, it can make it easier for you to introduce the person. But a lot of the time, I haven't gotten anything from people before. So I literally create their bio, for the show beforehand. So I look at their website, look at their social media, and I'll just create all this bio from them. It makes it easier for me as the host. And then basically, I think about what questions do I want to ask? There might be a few standard questions, but I think the best tip that I can give to people, if you've got a podcast, is ask the questions that you're curious about knowing the answer. Like, what do you really want to know the answer to? Because the energy when you ask that question is going to be different, because you're really going to be on the edge of your seat going, I really want to be paying attention to this. And you never know, it might go down a little bit of a rabbit hole and everything like that later. So really preparing some questions, but also allowing for, flexibility and being intuitive and, in the podcast as well, not being too regimented. So I just sort of, let my instincts guide me through that podcast of where I should go. And then, do a bit of a wrap up and what I think about the person, and then their links and how we can contact them and everything like that. And then I wrap up the show. So I have a simple intro, the body, I guess. Then I sort of wrap up and make sure everyone knows, everything about the host. And then I wrap up the show. That's the general gist. I know you're big on AI, Ronsley, as well. So I have more recently in the last month, tried a bit of chat GPT, some tools for some questions, just to do it. So it just helps speed it up. I still do my own questions because I think chat GPT isn't going to ask you those really cool questions, but it could give me a few questions like this to add in. Then I'll really think about what's going to be, some really, really valuable questions there.
What is the podcast and how do you create it right now? Like, what is your process before you hit record?
Yeah, so you've actually caught me in an interesting time, but my process is number one, find the guest. Now, either the guest finds me or I find them. Let's say, for example, I find the guest, I would reach out to them. I usually try booking a call. It's just way easier. I don't really go after big name people too much. I like the fact that I have just kind of like average people or whatever I call it. But I did do some really cool interviews in LA. And then we set up a time, and then I always do it in person. All my shows are in person. I think the only time I've done Zoom recordings was during COVID, and I was really reluctant to do it. That's just because I think the video performs way better. It's a better networking tool for me. It does mean you miss out on heaps of people, but I guess that's something I've kind of decided is big for me. And usually they'll come to me. Probably 9 times out of 10, they come to my studio. And I really like to say block off 2 hours. That's only for a 1 hour podcast, really. And the first hour or the first 30 minutes is we'll get a coffee. I just really have a chat with them. And I always say, like, don't share anything too good because I want to hear it fresh on the podcast. And then I always check the pronunciation of their name before I start. I just go, oh, it's Ronsley, right? Yeah, Ronsley. Okay, good. Just so I don't make myself look like an idiot off the bat. And so I'll be like, all right, you ready? Yeah, cool. Hit record. Ronsley, welcome to the podcast. And my question strategy is I open with the same question every time and I close with the same question every time. And then everything else in between, I completely wing it. I don't research my guests a huge amount. Obviously, I do some research, but I don't spend like half a day just digging into them because I like to go in from the perspective of the listener. I don't want to be like, I feel like sometimes I listen to podcasts and they start talking about stuff because they're on the same page, but I don't know anything about any of these two. That's my strategy, at least. And I've gone quite good at asking questions on the fly. I also find a lot of the beautiful stuff happens when you don't plan. The best questions are the one that you don't prepare for, and just being confident in yourself. But the first question I ask is, what did you do after high school? And then the last question I ask is, what advice would you give to an 18-year-old today? Or what advice would you give to someone who's about to enter their 20s and has no idea what they're doing? And then I just wing it from the rest. And then after that, we take the recordings. Ideally, I have 2 video recordings and 1 audio, but sometimes the cameras might cut halfway through, whatever. We throw that up into Premiere Pro. We turn the video into a multicam edit, which means it's just like one file when you can switch between the angles. I sync the audio and then I edit the podcast, but I don't really edit my podcast that much. Unless there's like a clear mistake or they clearly say something, I'll cut it out. But otherwise, I keep it pretty raw. If someone takes 10 seconds to think of an answer, I'll usually leave that 10 seconds in. That's just my strategy. And then I'll go through. And whilst I'm doing that, this is a really important part, I add markers on Premiere. And these markers pretty much saying this is a good TikTok clip. And so whilst we're going through, I'll add markers. I could do 20, 30, 40 markers in a 1 hour episode. Then we'll go through, write the intro, record the intro, export the whole thing as a video file. Now I'm using Spotify, so I can just upload the video file. So I only need 1 file instead of 2. But if you're not, you just re-export it as an audio. So you've got the video file for YouTube, the audio file for podcasting. Then where the fun part begins, which is where the time really gets sunken into, is going into every single marker, cutting it out, putting it into a fresh timeline. So I use one timeline. I'll cut it all out and just have like 30 clips on one timeline. And then I go through and edit them all, rearrange them, and what I call cut the fat. And when I say cut the fat, you have to be so vicious. Like if there's a second of an arm or a hesitation, cut it out. Cut out anything that doesn't progress the story. Anything that's not moving the main story, cut it out. And then we export all of those clips and then we kind of post them online. So you can see there's quite a lot in the back ends, and we've got to add the titles as well. Titles is really important, coming up with like a good title that engages the audience. Maybe music. Sometimes we do it in the TikTok app. Sometimes we do it on Premiere. But yeah, there's lots of different strategies. My friend even will write the title on TikTok, and he'll put a green screen behind it. And then he screenshots that and we upload that onto Premiere and remove the green screen background. That way you're using the exact text and fonts that they use on TikTok, because the whole point is you want to make it look native. You don't want it to look like, oh, someone's edited this. And yeah, then we post 10, 15, 20 videos an episode. Usually we get one or two go viral. Most of them flop, but that's the strategy. And that's kind of how I built the whole brand.
What you do during recording and what you do before recording. What kind of assets do you have at the end, and what do you do with them?
Sure. Well, in the end, the assets we have, of course, we have the edited episode, and that is video and audio. For a long time, we only use the audio. And so then the beginning of this year, we started going back to all of last year and re-editing the video and getting those uploaded onto YouTube also. YouTube launched their podcast earlier this year. And I think maybe March, April. Yep. But that was something that is very new, is they have a place where you can tag your videos as a podcast, which is really interesting. And so that's one of the things we wanted to make sure we were at the front end of, is to get on that. And if you're thinking about that, of using video on your podcast, do it and get it up on YouTube, tag it as a podcast, because they're promoting those pretty heavily. And so I think that's, one of the things that we have done. We've done video all along, but just really didn't use those in the early days. So we have videograms.
So we should talk about that YouTube strategy there, because I think that's so obviously hosted on another media platform like a Libsyn or something like that. And then you also host it on YouTube as a podcast. You do just one? Can you just host it on YouTube, make a podcast, and use that RSS link as a podcast everywhere else? Is that?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think they have the RSS capabilities. We use Captivate.
Got it.
And so that's where our RSS feed is. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So all your podcast platforms.
Right. Apple, Google, and Spotify, iHeart, Amazon.
And you have a great podcast landing page. Ladies and gentlemen, championleadership.com/podcast. And go check out that podcast page, SaaS Fuel with Jeff Maines, to the podcast, but way the landing page comes, I think it's very, very useful and very well done. You were talking about small pieces, your audiograms. I had to continue down that path.
So we started with just audiograms and then added images with our social post. And we started doing video shorts at the beginning of this year. And that was a real game changer in just getting more engagement, because shorts, I mean, they're everywhere. And people will watch that, because people will give you 30 seconds. They'll give you maybe a minute if you're good. And then if they really like it, then they'll consume the content. But, showing up in their feed, I think, is one of the most important things. And if you don't do that, then you get easily be lost in the giant sea that is YouTube or Facebook.
Thank you so much for listening. Listen to the back catalog of over 300 episodes by going to wearepodcast.com. If you're looking for something specific, let the We Are Podcast team point you in the right direction. Send us an email on podcast@wearepodcast.com. Also, if you know a business owner who has a podcast, ask them to listen. Share an episode with them. The conversations here are going to save them lots of trial, error, time, and money. Until next week, much love.